welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us again. Just a bit of housekeeping and technology. As we're getting started, please sign in to Slido like we did last week. If you weren't here last week, it's just a very simple web interface that allows us to collect questions and answers, and also for you to participate in some of our interactive things. So there's three options. We will drop the link in the chat here for you. So you can just click on that link. That should take you straight to it. If that doesn't work, you are welcome to use your phone and just scan the QR code there, and it should just take you straight to the web interface. Or if push comes to shove, just go to slido.com and enter the code 956 at the top of the page, and it should get you in there. And go ahead and sign into that, because as people ask questions throughout, you can actually upvote their questions. You can put questions of your own in the Q&A, but you can also vote and say, oh, that's a really important question. I want to hear an answer to that. And that way it'll give me a little bit of a signal for where we are, because I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions. There will be recordings that get sent out for each of these afterwards, and they're all posted on YouTube. So if you do not, if you miss a session or something, you can just go to the ICJS YouTube channel and find it. Okay. Let me do a very quick review from last week, and then we'll dive into our 15 centuries. So we focused in this course on how has the Christian tradition reckoned with having political power and also with resisting political power. And that's really the question that we're going to focus on. Today, we're especially going to focus on the having political power and where that has occurred and where it has really gone quite terribly wrong. I made the analogy last time of encountering a blob, and some people or some person is inside the blob, and you're outside the blob, and you're both trying to analyze and understand it. It's the same data, but we call being inside of the phenomenon of a religious movement participating in theology, and we call being on the outside and analyzing that religious studies. It's the same data that we're looking at, but we're approaching it from two different angles. And I want to keep both of these lenses throughout this course, because I think it's very important to toggle between these and recognize that they both have insights for us. So, and I presented two theses for the course. The religious studies thesis is that religious traditions like Christianity, but you could speak about Islam, you could speak about Judaism, Buddhism, right, contain multitudes and are multivocal. There are many voices within these traditions. And the same source texts and traditions that can bolster abusive Christian imperialism and supremacy can also provide inspiration to Christian resistance movements and the pursuit of justice and equality, right? All of that can be within the same religious tradition, religious community. On the theology side, I'm going to argue in all three of our sessions that Jesus and the early church lived a disempowered, colonized existence, and many in the early church had a radical anti-imperial vision of the equalizing kingdom of God. But as Christians have gained political and cultural power, they have frequently distorted Jesus's teachings and developed theologies to justify domination, greed, and other behaviors that were antithetical to Jesus's life and message. And we are going to get more than our fair sampling of things that are antithetical to the character of Jesus today. We also talked about the context of the early church and of the New Testament, the Roman Empire that really was the entire milieu of the whole early church experience, had an extremely brutal and rigidly hierarchical social system, with Caesar at the very top, a self-declared god, down to the slaves, who made up 35% of the population, and many people in the early church were enslaved. And Rome was generally pretty tolerant of other religions that were kind of making their way into the Roman Empire. They had ways of integrating other forms of polytheism, and they even managed to have a tenuous relationship with Judaism. It was there were hiccups along the way. There were pogroms and violence at different points, but overall, Jews, at least in the first century, were fairly calm within the Roman Empire. But when it comes to Christianity, the Romans got very frustrated. It was too new. It was too politically charged. It was too opposed to the imperial cult for them to just merely leave it alone. And so this leads to the phenomenon of persecution of the early church. Now, I think I touched on this point. I really want to hit it. This cultural reality, though, of colonial oppression, of brutal taxation, of constant violence, of male elite domination, is rarely mentioned or described in the New Testament because these are the waters that the early Christian communities are swimming in. In the same way that if somebody asked you, how was your day? You wouldn't say, well, I got up this morning and I put on clothes. And then I got into a vehicle and got onto a thing called a road. And there were all these other vehicles on that road with other drivers in them. And I drove for about 15 minutes and there was traffic and I had to stop at several traffic. We all assume that that is just part of our daily lives and we don't describe it to people unless there's something extraordinary about it, right? That is the reality for the early church. Colonization, domination, the patriarchy, the imperial cult, that's just the waters they're swimming in. And we need to recognize that context as we try to interpret the New Testament. Roman persecution of Christians, despite some of the early Christian claims, was not a constant phenomenon, but it was an episodic and often regional experience that many Christians had, and it left a very searing impression on the early church about their distance from political power, and it shaped a lot of the theology of the early church. And then we looked at a number of different texts, and I showed how across all these different genres and Christian factions that are a part of that early community, behind the text of the New Testament runs this deeply subversive, anti-imperial, anti-rich theme. And both in the preserved teachings of Jesus and in the first generations of Christians, that was the understanding of what Christianity was. So today I want to ask the question, how did we get from there, from the disempowered early church that has an anti-imperial orientation to Christian empires and Christian colonialism and Christian enslavement? All right, so I'll run you very quickly through the history that we're going to look at. So as I said, we're going to cover 15, 16 centuries today. So we're going to look at how the Roman Empire actually adopts Christianity, how this inversion happens from where the Roman Empire goes from persecuting Christians to embracing Christianity and utilizing Christianity. We're going to talk about the creation of this concept of Christendom and of Christian empires, how that plays out in Christian persecution of Jews and heretics in the early medieval period, really up until the present day. And we'll look at the Crusades and how this Christian enmity towards Islam emerges and grows. We'll look at the Inquisition, the wars that follow after the Protestant Reformations, and then we'll end by looking at European Christian colonialism and racism. And I'm going to argue that all of this is all part of a trajectory built around Christian imperialism. Okay, but before we get into any of that, I'm giving you a pop quiz. And yes, you will be graded on this, and you won't get your certificate from the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies if you don't get a great grade. I'm just kidding. We don't have certificates. All right, so I'm going to give you 9 questions. And on each of these, I'm going to have you put your answers in the chat. So go ahead and open the chat window on the side there. And on each of these, I want you to try that. You have the same 4 options for all of the answers, and all of these are Christian rulers or Christian leaders throughout history. So your answers are A, Constantine the Great, B, Charlemagne, C, Pope Urban II, D, Henry VIII. Okay, so question 1, who convened the Council of Nicaea that anchored the Christian doctrine of the Trinity? Seeing a lot of A, some B's, some C's. All right. I'm going to hold off on giving you the answers just yet. Okay, let's move on to question 2. Question 2, all right. Who ended Christian persecution in the Roman Empire? Again, same set of options. Seeing a lot of A's, a B, a C, some more B's. Okay. Great. All right. Question 3. Who began construction on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, perhaps the most important church in all of Christendom, in Jerusalem? Who was the Christian leader who started construction on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? Seen some B's, C's. Nobody's taking up Henry VIII. Come on, come on. All right, A, B, some C's. Interesting, interesting. Okay. Question 4. Who was the first Christian ruler to decree Sunday a day of rest for the realm? Seeing some D's. We're finally getting to Henry VIII. Here we go. A's, some lot of D's on this one, some B's, some C's. Okay. Question 5. Who began construction on the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome? Some C's, some Pope Urbans. A lot of C's on this question. B, A, D. Okay, we're getting a range of answers on all of these. Interesting, good. Okay, question 6. Who founded the capital of the Byzantine Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean? If I told you the name of the capital, it'd probably give it away. All right, A, C. Okay, interesting. Question 7. Who was credited by medieval scribes with establishing the papacy? Papacy is just the office of the Pope. Who do the medieval scribes claim established the office of the Pope? I'm seeing some B's, some C's. Somebody answered E. I'm not sure what they're doing with that. I see some D's, A. Okay. Good, good, good. All right, we got 2 more. Question 8. Who is responsible for Christians celebrating Christmas on December 25th? Again, range of answers on all of these. Okay, and here we go. Question 9, the last one. Who separated Easter from the Jewish calendar and pegged it to the Roman calendar? A's, some B's, some C's. All right. So let me give you the answers. And in fact, there's only one answer to all of these questions, and it's A. They're all Constantine. These are all things that Constantine the Great did. So we're going to look at Constantine, but I wanted to highlight just what a pivotal and important figure he is in Christian history, because so much of what we think about as the structures of Christianity as we experience it and know it actually get locked in the 4th century around Constantine. He's a crucial figure, and I think often we underestimate just what an impact he had on the Christian tradition. There are very few people that I think we can say completely changed the face of Christianity. Constantine's one of them. So before we get to Constantine, though, I want to go back a couple hundred years, back to that kind of bridging between the early church and the 4th century, and think about some of these theological debates that emerge in early Christianity. Christianity has at its center, the Christian tradition overall through the centuries, has a central set of theological debates. In Judaism and in Islam, there tends to be more focus on the question of not so much who is God. There's theological conversations in those traditions, but the question is more, what do we do? How do we live out the will of God? And this is where we talk about halakha and Torah and Sharia and fiqh. But in the Christian tradition, theology is central. And part of that, I think, is because at the heart of Christian theology are a set of paradoxes. That God is, that you somehow have a divine human in Jesus. How does that work? That somebody can be both God and man? You have this idea of a tripartite division within God that ultimately gets called the Trinity. How does that work? How do we think about that? And this leads to all kinds of intra-Christian discourse and debate trying to resolve or at least come to some sort of agreement or boundaries for how to have that conversation. And pretty quickly within the Christian tradition, these debates become framed in terms of orthodoxy and heresy, with both sides claiming that they are the orthodox position and that their opponents are heretics. And that term orthodoxy is important because it becomes central to all of the future debates within Christianity. And so it comes from the Greek orthos, which means straight or correct or right, and then doxa, right? Belief or worship or orientation. So to be orthodox means you have the correct beliefs, that you worship the right God, that you have the right conception of God, that you are oriented towards the real God. And so early within Christianity, you start to have these arguments. And this is starting some of it actually starts in the era of the early church. In fact, the defining debate of the New Testament is, are Christians part of Judaism? In other words, do Christians need to be Torah observant? And this is the major debate between the Apostle James and the Apostle Paul. And they don't come to an agreement. Go and read Galatians and the Epistle of James. They do not agree on this question. Early on, people start debating, if Jesus is God, how does he have a body? Is that body just fake? Is it an illusion? Is it called docetism? Can we somehow imagine that it's not a real human body? And people say, no, that's not orthodox. Are there ongoing definitive revelations through Christian prophets? There's a whole movement in the second century called Montanism, where these Christians come along and say, we are prophets, we're receiving prophecies. And the early church reacts in response to that. Also within the second century, you have this debate about what is the relationship between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and the God of the Hebrew Bible and the God of the New Testament. And some Christians start saying, actually, it's a different God in the Old Testament than in the New Testament. And the God that's revealed in Jesus is not the God of the Old Testament. And other Christians come along and say that's heresy. So this is all happening, though, still within the context of the Roman Empire and its domination. And so it's not merely intra-Christian or Christian Jewish, but you also have these ongoing Roman philosophical and polytheistic forms of scorn, and also these periodic persecutions of Christians. And so Christianity in the second and third century is kind of the edgy new kid on the block in the Roman Empire. Among these competing mystery religions and imperial cults and foreign religions that are making their way in, Christianity is kind of, it's edgy, it's controversial within the Roman Empire. And these theological fights, and I don't want to be idealistic about the early church, and we're starting to talk about this, the era of the church fathers. These could be very, very brutal theological fights. And sometimes they even got physical. Sometimes you had groups of Christians literally having a melee, a physical fight over what they think is the right position. But none of these Christian factions had true political power in the second and third centuries. So no one could actually excommunicate, as in fully remove communion, to basically force someone out of participation in Christian life, because people could always go join a different sect, go join a different faction, go choose the other side in a debate, right? All of this was still playing out within this realm of free, relative lack of power. And then along comes Arius. And so when we come to think about the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, and this is where Constantine becomes incredibly important, there's this North African presbyter, roughly you could translate that as priest today, he's a Berber. He comes from North Africa, from the kind of western edge of North Africa. His name is Arius, and he's in Alexandria, and he challenges the orthodoxy of the Bishop of Alexandria, the understanding that is dominant within the Alexandrian church of the relationship between God the Son and God the Father. And Arius, who is a very simple thinker and says, this is pretty straightforward. Arius says, I'm a father and I have a son. And my sons, they were born after me. I begat them, to use the King James, right? And so when we talk about the only begotten Son of God, there must have been a point where the Son was begotten. And so there was a time when the Son was not. This is the key phrase for Arius. There was a time. There was some period in eternity when God was just the Father. And then God begets the Son, and by implication, somehow the Holy Spirit as well, although that wasn't always clear in his theology. In other words, he's saying there's gradations in divinity. And God the Father is primary, and then the God the Son and God the Spirit comes out from God the Father. And this creates a genuine theological crisis. All the other arguments that had gone on before that were real, they were important. This one really electrifies the church in the early 4th century, and it becomes very popular. It's very understandable, the point that Arius is making, and it removes some of this paradox, right? You don't have to really think about this Trinity that is eternal and all these eternal beings, and how is it possible for a father and a son to both be part of the same being and be eternal and yet be a father and a son? That's hard to think about. And yet, most of the bishops there are hundreds of bishops by this point all over the Roman Empire, and most of them believe that this is heresy. And so they take an unprecedented step. Now, the context as well, though, is that suddenly we have Constantine entering the scene. And Constantine, as I said, is one of these rare figures who completely changed the face of Christianity. Now, Constantine it converts to Christianity around the year 312, at least officially claims. At that point, there are multiple claimants on the role of emperor, right? There's actually four different people who are claiming to be the Caesar, the emperor at that point. And Constantine is one of them. And so he's going into a battle with his opponent named Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge in 312, and he claims that he has a vision. He claims that it's not totally clear if it's a dream or a waking vision, but he has a vision. And in some versions of the story, it's a Chi-Rho, this kind of ancient symbol of Christianity. In some versions of the story, it's a cross. But he sees written across the heavens this message: "In hoc signo vinces," by this sign conquer. The symbol of Christianity is to be a symbol for conquest. Of course, just like Jesus said, right? The cross is a sign of conquest. I'm joking. So I want to note, though, even after his official conversion, Constantine continues to worship the sun god, who was quite a popular god at that point in the Roman Empire. His name's Sol Invictus, is even where we get the term Sol for our sun. And long after his conversion, Constantine continues worshiping, at least formally and publicly, the sun god. When he prints coins with his image on it, Sol Invictus is right behind him in these coins, even after his conversion. And Constantine waits until his deathbed to get baptized. So I think his piety is worth questioning. And but then when this Arian controversy breaks out, Constantine sees an opportunity to unite Christianity as a single faith and also a chance to consolidate his own power over Christianity. And so he decides to convene the Council of Nicaea. Now, in 324 CE, Constantine finally vanquishes his last imperial opponent, the last claimant of the four. And so he is now in control of the whole empire in 324. And then in 325, he convenes, he summons the bishops from across the empire by imperial injunction. He commands them to come to Nicaea, which is just outside of Constantinople. And he says he wants to resolve this Arian controversy, and he pays for their trip. And the bishops seemingly are quite happy to do this. They bring their entourages. There's some estimates there's maybe 2,000 people that gather in Nicaea, probably about 200 to 300 bishops, but then they all have entourages. And the product of what they create there is the Nicene Creed. Now, this is not the same creed that most of us who are Christians say in church. That's actually the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, but it's a very important part. It's a building block towards that ultimate creed. And I will argue that the Nicene Creed is a profound theological and an ingenious theological statement that resolves this Arian controversy. And today, 97% of self-identified Christians who are attached themselves to Christian traditions would say that is doctrine. That is a true statement of Christian theology, and it becomes the touchstone for all later creedal formulations of Christianity. I'm a fan of the Nicene Creed, but the process is terrible. Because in the process of getting this agreement, the bishops subordinate their authority and church leadership to Constantine. And in that process, they're co-opted by the very occupant of the office as the same office as that persecuted Jesus, that executed Jesus, that colonized his people, the Jewish people, that persecuted their ancestors, the early Christians. Now suddenly Caesar's on our side. And the official kind of records of the Council of Nicaea are preserved by I'm not sure I would call him a historian, maybe a propagandist named Eusebius of Caesarea. I just gave a little clip here of some of the ways that he speaks about Constantine at the Council of Nicaea, and this is in the official record. Such was the external appearance of this person, and with regard to his mind, it was evident that he was distinguished by piety and godly fear. This was indicated by his downcast eyes, the blush on his countenance, and the modesty of his gait. For the rest of his personal excellencies, he surpassed all present in height of stature and beauty of form, as well as in majestic dignity of mien, and the invincible strength and vigor. All these graces united in a suavity of manner and a serenity becoming his imperial station, declared the excellence of his mental qualities to be above all praise. Gag me with a spoon, right? But this is Christian theology after the Council of Nicaea. Suddenly, you have to cozy up to the emperor. Suddenly, we need to make sure the emperor's happy and that he feels like we are honoring him. Also, after this council is resolved, suddenly the heretics are not just people that you disagree with. Anyone who follows the theology of Arius gets exiled from the empire. And Constantine actually orders that Arius's writings be burned, right? We are going to end this Arian controversy. Now, ironically, this is a complete failure. The next two emperors after Constantine are actually following Arius, right? And then there's this back and forth between the Nicene party and the Arian party that goes on for the next 50 years. So like this doesn't actually resolve things. In fact, when some of the Goths actually wind up coming and conquering Rome and sacking Rome, they're Arians. They're Arian Christians who, after Arius gets exiled, he's still teaching these ideas and some of the Goths picked them up. So, but as we go through these, I want to highlight, and I'm going to use the analogy of dominoes falling. The first domino in this sequence, in this trajectory, is this idea that orthodoxy needs a political enforcer. That the church needs a bully to protect it and to protect orthodoxy. Now, we move forward from Constantine and from Nicaea into the period of Christian imperialisms. And here, imperialism, I want to think about both of the meanings of the term imperialism. Historically, it would just mean rule by an emperor, which is what we're talking about here. In the modern sense, when we talk about imperialism, it's about states expanding for expansion's sake, right? What Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine today is a form of imperialism. He is trying to expand the boundaries of his empire, not with any deep rationale other than he wants more territory. That's imperialism. So I want to hold both of those definitions together. So Constantine does end Christian persecution. He made Christianity a legal religion, but it's actually the Emperor Theodosius, about 50 years later, who extinguishes Arianism finally and makes Nicene Christianity the official religion of the empire, right? So there's this interim period where Christianity is legal, but not the official imperial religion. But after about the 380s, suddenly now we have an official religion. And the late Roman Empire was actually quite fragile in its kind of arrangement and unity. And so over time, you start having these two power centers because Constantine has created another capital in Constantinople, sometimes called Byzantium. That's in the east, and then Rome in the west. But Rome is more vulnerable to military invasion. And so you have these two competing power centers. And at the same time, as the church is trying to accommodate this new empire, the hierarchy of authority starts to develop within the church. This is where we begin to talk about the papal office. Catholic theology would say there were popes before Constantine. The Bishop of Rome, the Pope at the time, doesn't even attend the Council of Nicaea. It just was not a very important office. It was significant. There were multiple bishops who were very important to the church, but the Pope was not a thing. But then as it becomes an empire, you need a church hierarchy to mirror the imperial hierarchy. But you have two claimants on that office. You have the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. And they're both trying to make these claims on the empire. And this precipitates what is called the Great Schism in the 11th century, in the middle of the 11th century, where the Pope excommunicates the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicates the Pope. And this leads to this split between what is called then the Roman Catholic Church, the Western Church, and the Orthodox Church, which is the Eastern Church. And now there are multiple competing Christian empires as you start to develop the Holy Roman Empire versus what we would call the Byzantine Empire. They're still calling out the Roman Empire themselves. And this imperial expansion and alliances are now linked to Christian faith. So if you go and talk to people who are Ukrainian Orthodox, they might tell you the glorious story of the conversion of Prince Vladimir. Prince Vladimir, who's the ruler in Kiev, in the late 10th century, he's a pagan. But the emperor in Byzantium and Constantinople says, hey, we need some military assistance. Why don't you marry my daughter? But in order to do that, you have to convert to Christianity. And so Vladimir does. He converts to Christianity out of this religious alliance, out of this political alliance, and then he imposes Christianity on all of his realm. Everyone's forced to convert to Christianity. It's not actually a really nice story, right? That is how things now work, though. And so domino number 2 in the sequence is that orthodoxy now has geographical boundaries that must be policed and expanded. And this is where we come to the concept of Christendom. And Christendom, I defined this last week, but just as a review, is the geographical realm or set of governing entities that is ruled over by Christian political authorities. It's the geographical footprint of Christianity. Now, as we reviewed, there's no discernible trace that I can find in the New Testament or the very early church of this kind of political geographic conception of Christianity. That's just not the terms they're thinking in. They're so removed from political power, they aren't even thinking about that. But as this Christendom paradigm starts to set in, many of the Christian principles and practices from the early church become enmeshed with imperial power. And so that Jesus, the victim of imperial domination, becomes a tool of empire. And spreading the gospel, what Jesus commanded his followers to do in the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, go into all the world and share this good news and teach them to observe what I've commanded you. Well, now that becomes coercive. Right? It becomes attached to the imperial power and becomes tied to civic belonging. Because if you are in Christendom, then you better be a Christian. Otherwise, you're suspect. Because this is Christian land. And if you're going to occupy Christian land, you better be a Christian. Otherwise, you're an outsider. And we need to be worried about you. So then heretics, and we already start to see this with the Arius case, right? Heretics threaten the social order. Think back, the early church threatened the social order. But now suddenly the power has flipped and Christians are saying, if you're a heretic, you're a threat to our hierarchy and our power. And they could have their property seized, or they could even be put to death if they persist in their heresy, even if those people had legitimate criticisms of the church. But if suddenly the power has to be maintained, right? And then the Jews, right, Jesus' own people, become the proximate other, right? Because Jews are living in diaspora, but they are now interlopers within Christendom. And this previous Roman imperial political persecution of the Jews, which was again, not constant, but episodic. There were periods where the Romans would go after and attack Jewish communities. That gets blended with Christian anti-Jewish theology. And so now you start to have Christian attacks on Jews. And so domino number 3 in our sequence is that the previous orthodoxy heresy debates from the early church have now become a 2-tiered vision of humanity. So you have Christians on top, and everyone else is other. Whether they're Jew or pagan or Muslim, they are other. So Christians get a premier form of participation in society. Go forward a couple of centuries and we come to the Crusades. Now, to be clear, the Arab armies conquered the Eastern Mediterranean, most of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula in the 600s, right? They're conquering this from the Byzantine Empire, but also from the Sassanid Empire, the Persian Empire, right? By the time of the Crusades, around the year 1100, these lands have been under Muslim leadership and empires for about 300 years. But around 1095, this is after the schism between East and West, but the Patriarch of Constantinople is getting nervous because the Seljuk Turks, this kind of insurgent new movement within the kind of Islamic world, is pushing its way towards Constantinople. And he appeals to Pope Urban II and says, hey, we could really use some military assistance here, pushing back these Seljuk Turks to protect Constantinople. And Pope Urban says, you're right, we should take Jerusalem. You can just imagine the Patriarch of Constantinople saying, wait, that wasn't what I asked for. But Pope Urban decides, we need to conquer Jerusalem. We need to go back and take Jerusalem because it is the holy city. And so he calls the Council of Clermont in the year 1095, and he calls there for a holy war. that what we ultimately will call a crusade, because the Jerusalem is the navel of the world. This is the phrase that he uses. And the kingdom of the Persians, an accursed race, has taken it over. He even calls the Muslims pagans in there. Seemingly doesn't know very much about Islam. So when we talk about crusades, even that word, the word crusade comes from the French, and it literally means marked with the cross. And in his sermon, at least in the legendary records that we have of it, we don't have a direct transcript of his sermon, but in his sermon, Pope Urban invokes the words of Jesus. He says, Jesus commands in the gospel, he that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me. This is a disgusting use of Christian theology. Jesus was talking about embracing suffering on the way of serving others. That the cross is a symbol of imitating Jesus and embracing that suffering. And yet Urban II is saying, put the cross on your chest, put the cross on your shield, and kill our enemies. That is what Jesus summons you to do. And so Urban also offers what's called a plenary indulgence, the removal of temporal punishment for all of your sins. You can get spring free out of purgatory if you go on the crusade, and even if you die in the crusade. Right? So there's salvific theological attachment to the violence that is perpetrated. And this inaugurates a period of about 300 years of holy wars. And many of, at least the first few of the Crusades are very much directed against Islam, these Islamic empires and conquering Jerusalem. Along the way, though, on their way to go make this pilgrimage to Jerusalem to slaughter Muslims, the Crusaders stop off in Europe and slaughter a bunch of Jews because they're the proximate other, right? They're the heretics that are at hand. And then we get to the distant heretics. And when they take Jerusalem, it's a bloodbath. And they establish a Crusader kingdom in Jerusalem for less than 100 years before Saladin takes it back. So our next two dominoes, domino number 4, the cross, this instrument of imperial torture for Jesus, becomes a sign of Christian imperial conquest. And number 5, there's a holy land. This is a new concept. There's a holy land defined by Christian theology. This is still in our vocabulary. We still talk about the Holy Land. You'll even hear newscasters talk about the Holy Land, right? That there's a particular land that is itself sacred, and it belongs to Christendom. And killing the Muslims and the Jews, the enemies of Christ, to recapture it becomes a holy act of piety. Not long after the Crusades kick off, we get the Inquisition. Now, the term Inquisition is just just definitionally is just referring to a formal Catholic judicial process for investigating and punishing heresy, apostasy, blasphemy, witchcraft, and all other theological sins, right? And the first Inquisitions really kick off in the 12th century, right in the middle of the 12th century, so maybe 50 years after the Crusades start, right? And the idea is we're going to root out these dangerous heresies of people who did not adhere to the Catholic faith or submit to Catholic rulers. And in most of the realms where the Catholic Church had power, there were inquisitions. It was a very common thing. But the inquisitors, the ones who are leading the inquisitions, who are usually priests or monks, especially the Dominicans, get enlisted in this project of the Inquisition. They're allowed by papal edict to use torture in order to elicit confessions or to get heretics to denounce their heresies. And unrepentant heretics would often get life imprisonment, sometimes even death, right? So suddenly now torture of heretics at the hands of the church is legitimized. And the most notorious of the Inquisitions begins in Spain in 1748. And in Spain at this point, right, if you remember, the Muslim armies in the 7th century and the early 8th century conquer the Iberian Peninsula. And then Charlemagne stops them. And then but it's under Muslim rule for quite a couple centuries. And then you have the Reconquista, the Christian powers conquer it back. But Spain is very diverse. You have a bunch of Jews and a bunch of Muslims there, right? Even up into the 15th century. But there had been previous persecutions and pogroms against Jews in Spain. And so at the end of the 14th century, about 200,000 Jews, historians estimate, had converted to Christianity, ostensibly. Right? They were forced to convert to Christianity, but ostensibly they did. Now, those are called the conversos, or also called the new Christians in Spain at the time. But as the Inquisition is kicking off, these conversos are suspected of heresy because maybe they're still Jewish. They're suspected of insincerity, and they're expected that they are maintaining secretly their Jewish identities. And so part of the Inquisition project in Spain is to root out these conversos, to interrogate them, to torture them, to put them on trial, and then prevent them from holding public office and blocking them from intermarrying with old Christians. And it is in the midst of the Spanish Inquisition that you get the first racially governing edict in the Western world, where they start talking about protecting the blood purity of Christians against the Jews. Limpieza de sangre. We need to protect the blood purity. We can't intermarry. We can't let them mix with us. And those conversos, they're not really real Christians because we suspect them. And so domino number 6, we begin to see how race, or at least quasi-racial categories, even among Christians, even among self-professed Christians, are introduced to differentiate between superior Christians and inferior Christians. There's now tiers of Christians. This is also going on right on the eve of the Protestant Reformations. And I use the plural there intentionally because I think sometimes we talk about the Protestant Reformation in too simplistic of a way, as though it was one big movement. It was a chaotic bunch of movements. So there are many of the Protestant, so-called Protestant complaints about the abuses and corruptions of the Catholic Church have been circulating for centuries. This was nothing new in the early 16th century. And but those complaints have been repressed through inquisitions, especially in the case of the Hussites and the Wycliffites and the Waldensians. But they're generally, and even the critics of the Protestants, even people who are remaining Catholic, will agree there's some real problems that need to be resolved here. And so you have the Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic Reformation, that is going on at the same time as the Protestant Reformations are going on. So there's at least 4 major strands of the Protestant Reformation, and each of them is calibrating around this political power differently. Let me outline this quickly. I'm going to go super fast. I'm sure there are Anglicans and Episcopalians and Presbyterians and Anabaptists who think I'm not going to summarize them accurately. I'm sorry, we're moving quickly. So the first and the most kind of extreme, I would argue, towards this kind of idea of synchronicity between political power and church power is the Church of England, where Henry VIII, the Anglican Church, Henry VIII, he's very frustrated that he can't get divorces. He's frustrated that the Pope doesn't always go along with him. And so he says there needs to be perfect alignment between temporal and secular power and church power. I'm the head of the church. I replace the Pope. The king is the head of the church, right? There's a perfect alignment between church power and worldly power. Now, the Calvinists, or the Reformed tradition, they're not quite there with Henry VIII, but they want to say there should be cooperation between these two forms of government. The church and the secular government, they are operating in different spheres of authority. They have different kinds of authority, but they should cooperate in encouraging Christian morality. And in fact, John Calvin participates in the execution of a heretic because he thinks that the guy's name is Servetus. He persists in denying that the Trinity. It's a threat to civil order. We got to stop him. It's done by the civil authorities, but the church authorities are participating. Now, Luther, as with many things with Luther, loved his paradoxes, loved his contradictions. And Luther said there are 2 kingdoms. There's the kingdom of this world that holds the sword, and there's the non-coercive kingdom of God, where people have freedom. But Christians need to be dutiful citizens of both of those kingdoms. And so you have to have loyalty to your princes and your kings. You also have to have loyalty to God. And the way that this works out and cashes out for Luther, well, shortly after, Luther becomes a very public figure in these early squabbles around kind of these ideas of doctrine. There's a peasant uprising that breaks out in the Holy Roman Empire. And part of that peasant uprising is inspired by Luther himself, because people are saying, hey, wait, you're saying we have freedom. We should have equality too. And Luther sides with the princes and the aristocrats in putting down this peasant rebellion. He denounces the peasant rebellion. That is, you are not obeying the kingdom of this world, and so you're going to get the sword. And he advocates for violence against these peasants. Now, the far outlier in the Reformation are the Anabaptists, sometimes called the Radical Reformation. I would argue that consistently throughout the Anabaptist tradition, There have been blips, there have been problems. I'm not saying it's a perfect tradition, but consistently they have been a theology of resistance to this political power complex. And they have an early version, even in the 16th century, of this idea of the separation of church and state. And they're discouraging Christians from even holding public office because they see worldly power as intrinsically corrupting. And they're saying we should not have any part of that. So domino number 7, and this is now a Protestant domino. Now we see that Christian authority is not merely the realm of emperors and popes. Just about any aggressive power grab can be theologically justified. And so suddenly now it's not just a battle between popes and emperors for who is in control. Now there's all kinds of political authorities that are laying claim, using Christian theology to justify their political rule and often, almost always, their political oppression of their enemies. After the Reformation, you just have chaos in Europe. I mean, I also study Islam, and when I speak about Islam in churches, I get all these Christians, almost always Protestants, saying, well, when is Islam going to have a Reformation? And I'm like, do you know what you're asking for? The Reformation created just madness in Europe for 130 years. And so amid the theological fights of the Reformations, as you have these battling forms of Protestantism, and they're all battling against Catholicism, Europe just descends into chaos, with all kinds of new political entities claiming power and trying to carve out their authority and using these different new branches of Christianity to correlate and ensconce their own power. Now, obviously, you can't read all of that chart. It's very small. If you wanted to look it up, it's on Wikimedia Commons. I just wanted to illustrate. These are religio-political wars in Europe. Look at the period before the Reformation, before 1517, when Luther puts his 95 Theses up, and then look at the period after the Reformation. Suddenly, these are not just wars of Protestants against Catholics. Sometimes they're Protestants on Protestants, or a coalition of Protestants and Catholics against other Protestants. And even the Turks start to get involved in some of these wars. And sometimes they're joining different alliances. It's truly just a dog's breakfast for 100 years in Europe. And these brutal conflicts where all these military endeavors are sapping all the resources of Europe lead to widespread famine and plagues throughout Europe. And in fact, in some regions, especially in modern day Germany, as much as 2/3 of the population in some of these regions died between the wars and then the disease and the famine that accompanies the wars, right? It's a brutal, awful period of European history. This is on the level of the world wars in terms of the devastation it brings about. And it goes on for 120 years, right? And so at the end of this mayhem, there's a group of diplomats who gather in Westphalia, and they bring, and this is especially at the end of the 30 Years' War, you can see on the chart there. And at the end of the 30 Years' War, they gather in Westphalia, and they're like, we need to wrap this up. We need to come to some settlement of all of this chaos. And what they decide is the Holy Roman Empire is gone. And now what we have are these proto-modern nation states that are going to control their own borders and boundaries. They shouldn't interfere with what's happening inside the borders of others. If you're a Calvinist kingdom and the French are persecuting Calvinists, sorry, you have control over your area. The French have control over their area, right? But now these sovereign nations also control religion within their borders. And so domino number 8, this is the second to last one, these European sovereign nations replace empires, and whoever is sovereign in those sovereign nations, be it a king or a prince or elected officials or the aristocracy, they get to determine what is the established official religion. They get to regulate all the others. And that often means persecuting anyone else within their realm who does not conform to whatever brand of Christianity they've chosen. Because now there's a whole bunch of brands, right? You could be Church of England, you could be Lutheran, you could be Calvinist. Nobody really picks Anabaptist, they're way too peaceful. Or you could be Catholic, right? And those are all, and then there's all kinds of subdivisions within those, right? So suddenly there's a whole plate of options, all of them political, all of them organized around these different religious identities. And so we come to European Christian colonialism. And I think we sometimes forget about this, because we tend to think in terms of European history and then world history. But all of these Inquisition and Reformation developments are happening in the 1400s and the 1500s, right on the doorstep of the Age of Exploration, right? 1492, Columbus is sailing the ocean blue. 1517 is you got the Protestant Reformations, right? And you also have the Inquisition going on. In fact, the Inquisition really ramps up during the Reformation because suddenly the Catholic authorities have to prosecute these Protestants, right? And so all of this chaos in Europe is going on even as you have these expanding European empires, right? All these new European nation states begin carving up the globe into colonies and spheres of influences, and Christendom goes global. It's not just a European Mediterranean thing. Now it's global. And modern racism, and I can talk about this more in the Q&A, we don't have a ton of time, but modern racism itself is built upon the foundations of Christian imperialism, this idea of Christians versus others, except now you add race into the picture, and on these new quote unquote racial sciences. This is the period where people are trying to form new scientific fields, and a lot of the early forms of anthropology and sociology and linguistics are actually participating in this project of creating racial categories and subdividing humanity into these tiers of colonizer and colonized, right? And part of what they're trying to do with these racial sciences is to say, hey, wait a minute, why are we Europeans so dominant? Why are we doing so well? It must be because of our race and our religion, right? And becomes then the premise of white Christians, the white man's burden, white Christians need to rule the world. And so the slave trade and colonial exploitation and apartheid states, they all flow directly from these centuries of European expansion and domination justified by Christians, theologized by Christians, founded on Christian imperialism. And as these European nation states, proto-empires, are sending their armies of soldiers and bureaucrats to establish colonies around the world, they also send armies of missionaries to go and convert these benighted people to Christianity, to bring them, quote unquote, good news of the gospel that sure as hell sounds a lot like the gospel of Caesar that we looked at last time. Congratulations, you've been conquered, you are dominated, and guess what? We have a God on our side. And so domino number 9 is because of their self-declared racial superiority, white Christians claim dominance over non-white peoples. They coercively proselytize them, and yet, even if those people become Christians, they remain subjugated and hold inferior status, right? Just like the conversos, they're Christians. They say that they're Christians, but they can't be old Christians. They're just new Christians, and therefore inferior. Okay, we're going to take a little bit of a mental health break because that was dark. I understand. So we have just gone through the ugliest side of the Christian tradition, I think, bar none. So I want to just have a check-in moment on how you're feeling. So if you can, go over to Slido. You already got it open in your browser. If not, you can just open up the Slido window and enter, just open your browser, go to slido.com, enter 956. We're going to do a word cloud. So try to use just one word to describe how you're feeling. You can put multiple one words in, but try to use just one word answers. How are you feeling in light of this history that we've just examined? I'll say I share basically all of these sentiments that I'm seeing here. This is incredibly depressing and sad, and it does provoke hopelessness and disgust. It's humbling. I mean, it's important that we know this stuff, but it's overwhelming to face the horrors that have accompanied Christianity, that have all flowed out of this Christian imperialism. Okay. Let me try to summarize a little bit of what we've seen, what we've learned, and then I also want to offer a little bit of hope, and we're going to spend the rest of the time on hope. So let me just, before we get to hope though, let's have a few concluding thoughts here. So coming back to our two lenses, our religious studies lens and our theology lens, right? From a religious studies perspective, right? From the outside, looking at all of this development over these centuries, this is all part of Christianity. I mean, you can try to claim that there's some pure vision of quote unquote Christianity. Christianity is a human tradition. And this is all happening within Christianity. In fact, I would argue the majority of Christian history has been dominated by these theological paradigms, these forms of Christian supremacy and Christian superiority. But all of these imperial developments were historically contingent. They could have gone other ways. Constantine didn't have to convert. The bishops didn't have to go along at Nicaea. Christians could have resisted Christian imperialism. The Inquisition didn't have to happen, right? The Crusades didn't have to happen. There were people making choices along the way. It was not flowing out of or born out of some essence of Christianity. Remember, in religious studies, we're not dealing with essences. It could have been different. Now, from a theology perspective, and I speak now as a Christian, Christian imperialism has corrupted a huge swath of Christian traditions and practices and inherences with a logic of Christian supremacy and exclusion and racism. And that is what we receive today as Christians. And I will confess that as a modern Christian, it is actually very, very difficult to disentangle all of this stuff from the Christianity that we receive and that we hear preached. How do you hold? And I believe the Nicene Creed is beautiful. I don't cross my fingers when I recite it. I think it is a beautiful theological statement. But how do I hold that intention with the way that it opens the door to this Christian imperialism through Constantine's manipulation of circumstances? I'll also note, for those of us who might want to get on our high horses, all three of the major Christian theological traditions, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, are all implicated and enmeshed with this history. There are some tiny, smaller traditions that have resisted this, but those are the exceptions that prove the rule. Most of Christian history has been dominated by these forms of Christian dominance. And so when we think, and we're going to get there more next week, but when we think about modern Christian nationalism, modern Christian supremacy, modern Christian imperialism, all of those are arguably part of the mainstream of Christian theology and practice. If we are going to resist them, we have to recognize that we are resisting them from the margins. We're resisting them against the grain of much of the Christian tradition. And I think as Christians, we need to get our heads and our hearts around that, speaking to my fellow Christians, that there's a lot that we have to take account of when we grapple with Christian history. And that should lead to a great deal of humility for Christians. This is not a rah, Christianity's so great, and we just need to champion Christianity. Christianity has some really awful aspects to it. Let's talk about hope. So I want to talk about the theological voices of resistance in the midst of that, because amid all of this vicious imperial history, the anti-imperial values and vision of Jesus in the early church, they're still there. Right? Those are still embedded within the New Testament. Those are still embedded within the life of the early church. And Christians, throughout these 15 centuries of Christian imperialism, there are some Christians who keep returning to those sources, keep returning to those values. And so there are conscientious individuals, there are semi-official religious orders, there are even heretical communities are often carriers of theologies of resistance to this Christian imperialism, challenging the assumptions and abuses of Christian imperialism using Christian theology, right? They're using the same sources as these folks are using. Pope Urban can go around and say, Jesus said, take up your cross. And other Christians can come back and say, that is not what Jesus meant. You're citing him wrong, right? They're using the same texts. And so I've just profiled here a few of the ones that I would highlight before the 20th century. We'll look at more within the 20th and 21st century next week. But you have St. Francis and the Franciscans that have, not perfectly, but have tried to embody and live out this life of poverty and service that Jesus calls his followers to. You have the Waldensians, this movement that is persecuted by the Inquisition, is harassed by the Inquisition, is often, many of them are executed by the Inquisitions, but they're challenging papal authority. They're challenging the authority of the hierarchy and saying, hold on a minute, we don't have to bow to your hierarchy. What we want to read the Bible for ourselves. We want to teach this for ourselves. You have this movement of Beguines and Begards, these it's not an official religious order, but throughout really, I think it's the 13th, the 15th centuries, you have these lay orders who are trying to live out the values of Jesus. And they're also persecuted by the Inquisition. Even though they're not really theologically breaking away from the Catholic Church, they're just living by a different set of values. You have the Amish and the Mennonites, the inheritors of this Anabaptist tradition, who are pacifists, who refuse to take political power. And they're kicked out of many of the European states because of that. That's why they settle in Pennsylvania, right? Because they can't find a home in Europe, right? You have people like Frederick Douglass and other enslaved and ex-slave theologians who they hold on to Jesus, but they're willing to critique this whole trajectory that we've just looked at. And these leaders in these groups, they're often persecuted by Christian authorities. They're often excommunicated. They're often forced to relocate, but they also produce a counter tradition of Christians resisting this political power. So I would argue, in this moment where I would argue we are seeing Christian imperialism reborn, rising from the grave, now is a good moment for us to study and learn from these sometimes marginal but supremely important Christian theologians and movements from our history. We need to go resource the tradition, find the voices of resistance, find the dissident theologians, the dissident voices that have stood up to this imperial power. If we want to resist it in our day, we need to recognize we're in good company in history. And so for the rest of our time, I want to introduce you to one of my favorite theologians of resistance. And her name is Julian of Norwich. Now, we're going to spend about 20 minutes with her, and then we'll wrap up. Julian of Norwich, not a massively popular figure in Christian history, but a very, very important theologian, I think. Now, I want to be cautious because we call her Julian of Norwich. We don't actually know what her name was. We call her Julian because she was attached to the Church of St. Julian of Norwich. We don't actually know what her given name was. She seems to have almost lost it in history. And Julian winds up writing the first surviving book. There were probably other books written by women in English in the 13th, 14th century. This is the only one that we have today, at least the first extant book written by a woman in English. So she's writing not in the Latin of the church hierarchy. She's writing in the vernacular. She's writing in the English. Now, she's writing in Old English. So if you go and try to read her book in the Old English, it's like reading like Chaucer, right? Like it's not going to be an easy read. But you can read the modern translations of it and really get a sense for her theology. Now, we'll get into this more in just a minute, but Julian is what's called an anchoress. The male version of this would be the anchorites. And an anchoress or an anchorite, they're a special kind of ascetic, as in like self-denying and denying their bodies, an ascetic monastic order where the person will be sealed into a cell attached to a church, a one-room cell attached to a church where they would live out their lives. And Julian is not formally canonized. She's living in the 14th to the early 15th century. This is well before the Reformation, right? So she is Catholic, but she's not recognized as a saint within the Catholic Church. There are Anglican and Lutheran churches that have a feast day for Julian of Norwich. But so the different traditions have calibrated around her, and there are a lot of Catholics who really appreciate Julian. My mentor, who taught me Julian of Norwich, is a Julian of Norwich scholar. She's a devout Catholic, so she's valued across a variety of traditions, but she's not officially a saint in any of them. Now, within her context, and I think this is very, very important for understanding her theology, just rough timeline of her life. So she's born around 1342. We actually don't know specifically when she's born, but we get some clues from her writings. And we think she dies around 1416. At least that's the last time she shows up in a will, that somebody willed something to her. Now, when she's about 30 years old, Julian has a near-death experience. As far as we can tell, she's already been put inside the Anchorus cell. And as she's in the cell, she has this near-death experience where she comes right up to the verge of death by her own description. And she receives what she calls 16 showings, roughly revelations. She receives these 16 visions of Jesus and of Mary, of Jesus on the cross, of hell. And she's trying to kind of, it's a mystical experience that she has on her deathbed, and then she recovers. And she writes a version of this that she titles Showings. Now, this is the shorter version of this. About 22 years later, in 1395, she publishes a longer version. And if you pick up most editions of the Showings, if you get an edition of the Showings, it'll usually include both the shorter version and the longer version. It's very interesting to compare them, because somewhere along the way, in these 20 years, if you go and read and compare the earlier version and the later version, it's the same set of showings, it's the same set of revelations, but she reflects on them a lot more in the longer version. Somewhere in that 20 years, she has gained a PhD level knowledge of Christian theology. She is incredibly well-versed in the longer version of the Showings in theology. That doesn't show up in the earlier versions. So somewhere she's in a cell, but she's reading voraciously Christian theology, and she's putting her own mystical revelations into conversation with Orthodox theology. So, but as all of this is going on in her life, the world around her is just insane. So at this period in Catholic history, you have what's called the Avignon papacy, where from 1309 to 1376, the French kings take over the papacy, move the Pope from Rome to Avignon, and they control the papacy. And then, as that is coming to an end, you also have the Black Plague cycling through Europe. In fact, the Black Plague comes to Norwich 3 times before Julian is 30 years old. Some people have even theorized that her near-death experience is from the Black Plague. The Black Plague is so brutal in England that 1/3 of the population dies over the course of these 3 rounds of the Black Plague. And half of the clergy die. Half of the clergy die because they're the ones who are ministering to these people who are dying. And so you have, I mean, with COVID, we lost what, maybe not even 1/100th of the US population, about 1 million people. It's 1/300th of the US population, maybe. Imagine 1/3 of the population dying in the space of about 15, 20 years. And then after that, right after her first experience of the Showings, you have what's called the Western Schism, where as the Avignon papacy is breaking up, you have 3 different people all claiming to be pope at the same time, all battling over the office of the papacy, right? So the church hierarchy is in chaos. In 1381, in part because there's so much social upheaval after the Black Plague, people are trying to kind of reorganize and reorient around society. There's a peasant uprising, a revolt in 1381 that is brutally put down by the church and by the king of England, by the local authorities. In fact, the person who's responsible for putting down is actually the Bishop of Norwich, who may have been the one who presided over Julian being interred inside the cell. His name's Henry Despenser. And Henry Despenser, he's known for taking a failed crusade to Flanders. He tries to have a crusade against the French. He's known for severely repressing this peasant revolt. He's also known for persecuting the Lollards, the followers of John Wycliffe, this kind of early dissident, in almost a kind of proto-Protestant figure in England at the time. Right? So the world that Julian inhabits is dark, it's brutal. There's death all around her, including within her own cell. And her daily experience of life is she's enclosed in this cell alone for the rest of her life. What they do with an anchoress or an anchorite, they would put them in the cell. They'd seal up the door. If you go to Norwich today, there's a door on the cell. That's just so people can see it. At the time, there was no door. There's no way to leave that cell. And she's evidently already in there when she has this near-death experience. And in the iconography of Julian, she's often depicted with a cat. And many people think that, oh, isn't that wonderful? She's like the patron saint of cats. If it's accurate that she did have a cat, it was probably just to keep the rats at bay. Now, anchoresses and anchorites, they're put into their cell with this elaborate ceremony of burial. They're going to die in this cell, is the implication of that. And in fact, they would even spend times as they are meditating, digging their own graves as a way of meditating on their impending death. Right? Now, this sounds insane to our modern sensibilities, but it was a form of asceticism. It was a form of piety, a form of spiritual reflection and practice. And they would have in this cell, they'd have a window that faces out into the town where they could receive food donations and converse with people in the town. So they're not socially isolated. They're interacting with people in the town, but they're living in the cell. And then they'd have another window into the church through which they could participate in some of the church services and receive communion. So I want to read some passages from the showings. And really, I cannot do justice to the showings in 15, 20 minutes. Please go and read these texts. They're not incredibly easy texts because they're translated from the Old English, but they're rich, beautiful texts. Let's look at a few of them. And by the way, as I'm going along, feel free to put observations and comments in the chat, and I'll try to kind of interact with those and bring those into the discussion. We've got way too many people to be able to unmute and talk. We've got almost 150 people in here, but I want to see kind of what you're noticing as we go through these texts. Okay, so here's a few passages from the showings. She says, I perceived, and I just want to note, pay attention to how she claims authority, right? She's a woman. She's not formally theologically educated. She doesn't hold formal church authority, but women mystics throughout history, and this is not only true within Christianity, this is true in Islam, this is true in Judaism. In the midst of patriarchy, one of the ways that women can claim religious authority is through experience, through mystical experience. And so she has to be careful not to criticize the church hierarchy, but to also carve out her own form of authority. So she says, I perceived truly and powerfully that it was Jesus who just so, both God and man, himself suffered for me, who showed it to me without an intermediary. And in the same revelation, suddenly the Trinity filled my heart full of the greatest joy. And I understood that it will be so in heaven without end to all who come there. For the Trinity is God. God is the Trinity. The Trinity is our maker. The Trinity is our protector. The Trinity is our everlasting lover. The Trinity is our endless joy and our bliss by our Lord Jesus Christ and in our Lord Jesus Christ. Now notice, right, without any intermediary, somebody called attention to that in the chat, right? She's like, I didn't have any intermediary, that God just revealed this to me. Right? And so how can you criticize somebody who's gotten a revelation without any intermediary, right? This is the thing about mystical experience, is you can say like, that doesn't line up with my theology, but you can't say you didn't have that experience, right? And so there's a different form of claiming authority. There's a different epistemology to Julian's theology that is not purely about the hierarchy of the church, right? And notice how you might think, if you know about the circumstances of Julian's life, that her theology would be dark and foreboding and deathly. But instead, it's incredibly light and hopeful. She offers this beautiful vision of the life of the community, of the life of a Christian. Let me give another one here. So this is from again, as she's kind of these are all from the longer version where she's reflecting back on these showings or these revelations. She says, "I'm not good because of the revelations, but only if I love God better. And inasmuch as you love God better, it is more to you than to me. For we are all one in love. For truly it was not revealed to me that God loves me better than the humblest soul who is in a state of grace. For I am sure that there are many who never had revelations or visions, but only the common teaching of Holy Church, who love God better than I." Right? For Julian, there's no two tiers of humanity. There's no superior Christians and inferior Christians. She's like, the superior Christians are the ones who love God more. And there's got to be a bunch of people around me who are much better Christians than I am, even as she's devoted her life to living in a cell attached to a church, right? These other people must love God more than me. For it is in the unity that the life of all men consists who will be saved. For God is everything that is good, as I see. And God has made everything that is made, and God loves everything he has made. For God is in man, and God is all. And he who loves thus loves all. To love God is to love your neighbor, right? That's Jesus. She's also, I'll note, she doesn't cite it, but there's all kinds of Augustine in Julian's theology. She's deeply immersed in the theology of Augustine. Where she got access to Augustine, we have no idea. Some people are noting Hildegard of Bingen, another wonderful female mystic from roughly the same time period, right? These women theologians, and they were often writing in the vernacular languages because they didn't have access to the Latin, but that meant they spoke to different audiences as well. Right? Part of the reason that Julian is so cherished is that people could read her in English. They didn't have to know Latin, right? Somebody says she speaks with authority, empathy, and an egalitarian, open-hearted belief and practice. Excellent, yeah. Okay, let me give you a couple more of these. So she says, Holy Church will be shaken in sorrow and anguish and tribulation in this world, as men shake a cloth in the wind. Yes, I even saw that our Lord rejoices with pity and compassion over the tribulation of his servants. And he imposes on every person whom he loves to bring him to bliss something that is no defect in God's sight, through which souls are humiliated and despised in this world, scorned and mocked and rejected. Remember that's also what Jesus talked about. And he does this to prevent the harm which they might have from the pomps and pride and the vainglory of this wretched life. What a beautiful phrase. And to prepare their way to come to heaven into endless everlasting bliss. For he says, I shall completely break down in you your empty affections and your vicious pride, and then I shall gather you to make you meek and mild, pure and holy through union with me. Right? So in other words, she's saying sin and suffering, those are not defects in this world. Those are the things that keep us humble. Those are the things that keep us from deadly pride so that we can be united with God. It requires humility and a character of being meek and mild like God to be united with God. And she's not explicit about challenging the church hierarchy. When you think about what's going on in her world, this is a radical, radical message that is undermining the power of the broader church to say all these people who are claiming power, it's just pride and vainglory, right? What is Constantine? What are the emperors? What are the kings? They're all just looking for pride, but we are being trained in life for humility. That God is orchestrating things in our lives to teach us humility. A bunch of you are throwing excellent female mystics and teachers in the chat. Thank you. Okay, just a couple more of these. I'm actually going to skip this one because I really want to hit these last two. Okay. I saw and understood, again, how does she know what she knows? That the great power of the Trinity is our Father, and the deep wisdom of the Trinity is our Mother. And the great love of the Trinity is our Lord. And we have all this by nature and in our essential being. The second person of the Trinity, which is how Christians refer to the Son or to Jesus, is our mother in nature and in our essential creation, in who we are grounded and rooted. And he is our mother in mercy, in taking on our sensory being. She's talking about how Jesus became a human being. But for her, Jesus is a maternal figure in doing that. And so our mother, in whom our parts are kept unparted, again, beautiful phrasing, works in us in various ways. For in our mother Christ, we profit and grow, and in his mercy, he reforms and restores us. And through the power of his passion and his death and rising again, he unites us to our essential being. She's not saying you need to convert into something else, but Jesus lets you become who you essentially are. He unites us to who we essentially are. Our parts are kept unparted in him. This is how our mother mercifully acts to all his children. I love how she plays around with her pronouns. This is how our mother mercifully acts to all his children who are submissive and obedient to him. Right? People are noting the mercy in here, right? And she's also very, Julian's theology is very bodily. There's a wonderful passage where she meditates in the showings on the process of poop, of defecation. And she just has this little meditation on, like, isn't it incredible that we take this food into our bodies, and she has this image of, and it's like it's sewn up in a little purse and then it comes back out again, processed and gone. Right? Not something that many of us are singing praise songs about, but for Julian, even the processes of our body are part of God's grace, are part of God's mercy. Just one more, just to close out this mother theme. The mother can give her child milk to suck, but our dear mother Jesus can feed us with himself. And he does so most generously and most tenderly with the Holy Sacrament. She's talking about communion, which is the precious food of life itself. And with all the sweet sacraments, he sustains us most mercifully and most graciously. The mother can lay the child tenderly to her breast, but our tender mother, Jesus, he can familiarly lead us into his blessed breast through his sweet open side. She's talking about the wound in Jesus' side where the spear went in, the Roman soldiers pushed in, and show us within part of the Godhead and the joys of heaven with spiritual certainty of endless bliss. We get stuck inside the wounds of Jesus, and that's how we know a mother's love. And in this, I saw all the debt we owe at God's bidding for his fatherhood and motherhood is fulfilled by loving God truly. That's the duty, is to love God truly. A blessed love which Christ arouses in us. Right? This is again straight out of Augustine. We love because he loved us. We come to rest in God. We will not find rest until we rest in God. Right? But she's doing it with a theology of motherhood, the motherhood of God, the motherhood of the Trinity, the motherhood of Jesus. And all of this is in profound contrast to the power struggles that are going on all around her. So again, I say all of this because I just want to recommend to you to go and read Julian of Norwich. She's a wonderful, wonderful theologian. I'll send out some excerpts from her if you want to dig into them a little bit. But pick up one of the copies of her books. There's critical editions. There's more readable editions. There's a lot of different translations of her. It's not hard to get a copy of Julian Norwich, and I think you will be very, very blessed by it. Okay. As we think about our final session, next week, I want to come back to the 20th and 21st centuries, to our own present moment. And I want to think about these modern Christian theologies of resistance and what happens when the colonized and enslaved people do theology for themselves. I think one of the most beautiful things about the Christian tradition is that even as European imperial Christians went and colonized the world, many of the people that they colonized did become Christians, but they rejected the imperial theology. They found Jesus underneath the imperial theology. And then they resisted and fought back against the imperial theology. And we, especially those of us who are white Christians, who are the inheritors of both the privileges and the dishonor of this tradition, we have a lot to learn from Christian theologians around the world who've gone through the experience of colonization with their peoples and have found Jesus in a new way. I also want to think about next week these new iterations and resurrections and reanimations of Christian imperialism that we're seeing all around us. Not just Vladimir Putin, not just Christian nationalism, but we are seeing Christian imperialism rise again. Why does Donald Trump keep talking about going and taking the Panama Canal back? Why is he talking about Greenland? Right? This Christian imperialism, this expansion for expansion's sake, premised on Christian theology, is still with us. It's still driving many of our dynamics in our politics. I want to think about how those theologies themselves, this reanimated Christian imperialism, is a threat to global peace and security and also to American pluralism. And then I want to also try to think about, can we ever get to a post-Christendom era? Is it possible for Christianity to move into that? Okay. We've got 5 minutes for Q&A. Again, I'm happy to stay later than that, but if some of you need to hop off in 5 minutes, that's totally understandable. Okay, let me pull up here the Q&A that you all have done. So this is, again, I'm looking at Slido. So if you have more questions or want to vote on questions, please go into Slido. I'm only seeing 2 questions in here. I think some of you might have thrown them in the chat, but there's so much in the chat that I'm not able to track it all. So please, if you have questions, put those in Slido or vote on other people's questions in the Slido. So let me try tackling the ones that we got here first. So somebody asked, where are the Quakers in all this? Are they Anabaptists? I'm trying to do my forgive me. I think I might get this right, but double check me. If I recall correctly, I think the Quakers are a break-off sect within the Anglican tradition. I think in part they're inspired by this Anabaptist tradition. Part of what happens in Protestantism is all these currents cross-pollinate. And so there are Anglicans who are informed by Reformed theology. There are Baptists who are descendants of the Calvinists, but there are also Baptists who are descendants of the Anabaptists. The really clear strands of this Anabaptist theology are especially found among Mennonites and Amish today. I do think the Quakers had some inspiration from the Anabaptists as well, but I'll try to look into that before next week. Okay, what was happening across Northern Africa at this time? The Tigrinya church goes way back into mid-1st century, I think. I'm not familiar with the Tigrinya church. I'll have to look that up. Across North Africa, so if you recall, even Arius and Augustine are both living in North Africa. We often forget how much African theologians contributed to the early church. Now, they were often Roman citizens, so it's not racially, it's not always clear, and the concepts of race in the ancient world are not what they are today. So I wouldn't say that they were African in a sense of that they identified as African, right? But they were part of the Roman Empire living in North Africa. The church was vibrant across North Africa. It was a very important center of Christianity. As you have the Arab conquests in the 6th and 7th century into the 8th century, it goes across North Africa. Those lands are ruled over by Muslims, but there's still a lot of Christians in there. There's also a lot of Jews who are in there, especially in Morocco. And then over time, over centuries, many of those Christians wound up converting to Islam. But you still had churches that were present in those spaces and still do today. And there are Christian traditions in Africa that trace their roots back to the early church, especially the Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its roots back to the early church, even to some of the passages in the Bible about the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 6 or 8, I think. Somebody asked, early on, you mentioned 97% in agreement. What happened to the 3%? Great question. So when I say 97%, Nicaea and the Nicene Creed becomes what we would call an ecumenical creed of the church. So obviously the Arians, the followers of Arius, don't agree with it. But the Arianism, especially after Theodosius turns the whole empire Christian, Arianism basically dies out over a couple centuries. But as you have these break-off movements, after Nicaea, there's the break-off of the Church of the East, the break-off of the Oriental Orthodox churches, the Coptic, the Syrian Orthodox churches. But all those people are still holding to the Nicene Creed. So then, and of course, you have the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Protestants, all those folks all embrace Nicaea. There are forms of Christianity, most of them emerging in modernity in the last couple hundred years, that have rejected some of these Nicene formulas, and especially even some of the ideas of the Trinity that come out of that. So I'm thinking especially of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses. There are some smaller Christian movements that are also non-creedal, in the sense that they don't affirm the early creeds, but they still identify as Christian. So when I say 97%, that's just, at least by kind of global surveys, what percentage of Christians belong to these 5 ancient traditions that attach themselves to Nicaea? It's a great question. We've got a ton of questions. Great. With some Christian groups, any resistance can be perceived as demonic. How do we address this? That's a great question. Yes, this is a very, very difficult part of this dynamic. Is one of the very easy Christian dodges, and it's often used by Christians who have cultural and political power, is to say that anyone who resists them is following the devil. And I mean, this was used against Jews. This was used against quote unquote heretics. This has been used against Muslims. This has been used against people of every religious tradition, been used against people who are basically secular. And I think I would urge those who are Christians to be very, very careful about deploying that language, because you can literally demonize people by saying they're filled with demons. And that's a very, very easy Christian dodge to say, I don't have to deal with your ideas, because it's just demons speaking through you. So therefore, I don't have to deal with you. And I'll just note that I study the Christian leaders who surround Trump, and this is one of their favorite dodges, is to say anyone who opposes us is inspired by demons. And so I think it's fine for Christians to believe in demons, but when you project those demons onto other people and say, I don't have to treat you as a human being because there's demons that are driving your behavior, you're dehumanizing that other person. I think we need to engage with each other as human beings, recognizing that we are all created in the image of God. And then if you want to kind of have a demonology, a theology of demons, or an angelology, fine, but let's not introduce that into the conflicts as a short circuit for the dialogue and debate. Okay. Somebody asked, is it possible that the revival of Christianity in the global South may become another Christendom? Yes, it is. Yeah, there are bad theologies that also cycle through the global South and come out of the global South. I mean, there's nothing, again, there's nothing pure about Christianity, right? And all right now, even in parts of Africa, there are places that were colonized by different strands of Protestant theology where there are tribal identities that are built around Calvinism and Lutheranism. And those people and those tribes will war over these things, right? They're referring back to 16th century European debates, but those things have become encoded within tribal identities, right? So no, the legacy of this Christendom stuff, it's still with us. It's not that every person who is not European who has become a Christian has resisted it. In fact, there are strands of this Christian supremacy theology, and we'll talk about this some next week, that are thriving around the world. They're often coming out of the United States, but they're also coming out of other parts of the world into the United States. And I think we need to be attentive to the reality that Christian supremacy, this idea that Christians should have power over others, it's got a long tail, and it has lingering effects, and the effects of that colonialism is still with us. Somebody asked, can you perhaps add to in the liberation theology that evolved? Yes. So we'll talk some about liberation theology. I'm absolutely not going to have time to cover in depth all the different forms of resistance theology, but I do want to point towards some of the different strands of resistance theology. And really in a 3-session course, I'm trying to sketch for you some of these huge conversations and encourage you to go and delve into some of these theologies. Yes, but we are going to talk about liberation theologies. We're going to talk about post-colonial theologies. We're going to talk about post-Christendom theologies, anti-Christian nationalism theologies, Black theology, womanist theology. We'll look at all of these different forms of resistance theology that have emerged after this kind of Christendom era and in resistance to this Christendom era next week. Somebody asked, okay, can you say more about understanding ourselves as at the margins of the Christian tradition with Christian nationalists in the mainstream? Sure. I would argue that since at least the 5th, probably the 4th century, Christianity has been dominated by imperial theologies. That's the bargain that the bishops make at Nicaea, is that they will have political enforcement for their orthodoxy. And I think that has warped a huge part of the Christian tradition around these ideas of power, around the idea of Christian empowerment. Jesus preached a gospel of Christian disempowerment. Jesus preached a gospel that Christians are supposed to be the servants. The idea that Jesus would want Christians to claim superiority over other human beings. I mean, go and read the Gospels and try to find that message, right? And yet, so much of Christian theology throughout history has embraced this idea of Christian power, of Christian superiority, that Christians are better than other human beings, that Christians are somehow entitled to power, are entitled to control, as opposed to being the servant of all, the slave of all, as Jesus teaches in Mark and the other synoptic gospels. So no, I think so much of the tradition, again, not all of it. There are these threads of resistance, and there are still beautiful things, even embedded within these larger traditions that also are participating in this Christian imperialism, right? I mean, Constantine gave us some beautiful architecture too, right? But we have to take the good and the bad together and not pretend that we can just claim the good without being impacted by the bad. And so I think if for those of us who want to resist, and I would argue that this is true in American Christianity as well, if you are going to resist the regime of Christian Trumpism, they're going to be marginal. And I think Christianity is best lived from the margins. And so we are in good company. And I'm suggesting that we can find great resources from within the tradition that can also help us with that. Not only the Bible, which I recommended last week, go and study the New Testament to be inspired for dissidence against the colonial and imperial regimes. There are other voices in the tradition that I think we can resource more deeply. Okay. I think this is going to be the last question. How do you read the interaction between sexual politics, patriarchy, male hegemony, focus on the family, etc., and military expansion at a national level? Great question. Yeah, this is we didn't get as much into gender. Obviously, we were talking about some of the gender dynamics around Julian, but patriarchy is a huge part of this too, right? The fact that you have male-dominated leadership and hierarchies over these churches, over these empires. I mean, yes, there were sometimes queens over the empires as well, but the way that patriarchy has asserted itself in these spaces, and the fact that women's voices are often excluded from the histories, other than when they finally can write in the vernacular and use their own voices. We don't have a lot of women's voices prior to the late Middle Ages. We get accounts of female Christian martyrs in the early church, but we don't hear it from their perspective really. And so yes, this is also another dynamic that is embedded within all of this, right? And it's so easy when you're already separating out tiers of humanity and saying some of us are good and some of us are bad, some are real humans and some are not humans, some are real Christians and some are fake Christians. It's very easy to impose that on this most fundamental part of who we are, on sex and on our bodies, and say, well, your body's different than mine, therefore I have a superior body, right? So no, gender and patriarchy, all of these things, they're all attached to this. And I think part of what we're seeing as we see a resurgence of Christian nationalism, a resurgence of Christian imperialism, a resurgence of Christian supremacy, is a resurgence of Christian patriarchy. And there are, and we'll look at some of them next week, but there are pastors, popular pastors in America today, who are arguing that the right to vote should be taken away from women. And they have big followings. And a lot of Trump supporters love those pastors. They're very popular. And they're saying women shouldn't have the right to vote. We should repeal the 19th Amendment. So patriarchy goes hand in glove with a lot of this stuff. And that's part of why I think we need the voices like Julian, right? The voices that are coming from a different perspective and that are arguing for the motherhood of God, because that has been, and I think Julian is operating well within the bounds of Christian orthodoxy, even as she's pushing that orthodoxy and saying, even within the language, the framework of Nicene orthodoxy, we can still speak of God as mother. And she's Trinitarian. She's not forsaking the Trinity, but she's finding ways to bring her own experience, her own bodily experience, into contact with Christian theology in a quite profound way. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who stuck around for a little while longer, we'll be back next week. We'll have our last session, and again, we'll send out an email, a follow-up email with some of the resources from today. We'll try to grab some of the resources that were recommended in the chat as well. Feel free to email our info line if you have other things that you'd like to recommend to be integrated into that, and I'll send out some excerpts from Julian if you want to read those as well. Thank you all. Have a good evening.